So, prejudice can be expressed on a large scale through public opinion. Self-interest affects public opinion on an individual and societal level. Education affects public opinion. One's level of education, one's type of education. For example, the predilection towards liberalism is not shared by highly educated engineers or physicists. Not all of them, anyway. It's mostly in the humanities where that is the case. English, history, that sort of thing. And the press can shape public opinion. It can do so legitimately through columns and opinion reporting, commentators, and it can do it illegitimately through abusing its rights in order to give a distorted picture of the news. And there are, unfortunately, many news outlets that do this. By the way, before I leave that, this used to be a problem. And then it got better. And then it got worse again. In the very late 1800s, there were a number of newspapers called the yellow journalists, the yellow press, because of the cheap newsprint that they printed their papers on. They tended to be yellow. The yellow journalists, the yellow press, were sensationalists. They would try to sell newspapers on the basis of these ridiculous headlines that would cause people to, yeah, I want to buy a paper, and then they read, and it's man bites dog. It's the classic, man bites dog. People are, dog bites man, that's normal. Man bites dog, that's weird. And it's, they open up the paper and it's a hot dog stand. Man bites Frankfurt or man bites dog. But these yellow journalists would also try to shape public opinion. In 1898, a yellow journalist named William Randolph Hearst, who owned newspapers around the country, was selling newspapers by stoking war fever over the Spanish occupation of their colony, the island of Cuba. When an American battleship blew up there, before anyone could find out exactly why, Hearst's newspapers blamed the Spanish for mining or torpedoing the USS Maine. Remember the Maine became a battle cry, and the United States goes to war in the 1898 to 99 Spanish-American War. The world is changed because a man wants to sell newspapers. The people, the public opinion was stampeded. That shows you the power of an activist press. Well, in the early 1900s, journalistic standards and the expectations of the public changed. After going to war because a guy wanted to sell newspapers, by the way, we now think the Maine blew up because of an accident. It's a very hot night. They were a coal-powered ship. Coal dust can combust without any kind of spark under certain conditions, and that's probably what happened. The Maine blew up because its coal sparked because of the heat and pressure and humidity, and it blew the ship up. It probably was an accident, but we still went to war over it. So in the early 1900s, before and around World War I, most large newspapers and as radio and television stations developed afterwards, they pledged themselves to an ethical standard, which basically said, we are going to make as sure as we can possibly be, we are going to make our straight news sections without distortion. We're going to report on the news, let the facts speak for themselves, and we're not going to get in the way of it. We're not going to try to nuance things. We're not going to try to shape public opinion. We're just going to report the news. If you want opinion, open up the editorial page, read the columnists, the commentators, and the letters to the editor. Otherwise, straight news. And most news outlets from the 1920s until probably the 1980s tended to be interested in the idea of pursuing straight news without distortion. However, as the political divide between liberal and conservative between liberal and conservative Americans grew in the 1980s, 90s, and 2000s, that began to change. Most media outlets are staffed by fairly liberal people. To be a reporter means you have to have a skepticism about power and even maybe a little cynicism about the self-interest of politicians. And for whatever reason, most reporters tend to be liberal. Many editors and managers of news organizations also tend to have liberal biases. Now, from the 1920s through the 1980s, they would try their best to control those biases, and the public sort of insisted that they do. But into the 1990s, the biases of many media outlets became more and more and more obviously progressive, liberal, left-leaning. So new news organizations and new forms of media came to serve another point of view. Talk radio, Fox News, and others tend to appear in order to express a conservative take on the news. Now, Fox's slogan is fair and balanced news. But most liberals would argue it's conservatively slanted news. Most conservatives would argue that what you see on ABC, CBS, NBC, MSNBC, CNBC, CNN are all liberal tilted news. And that's what we have now. We have news organizations that are either right-leaning, conservative, libertarian-oriented, or left-leaning, liberal, progressive, maybe even towards socialism. We're back in the age of yellow journalism on both sides. And I've shown you stories that are a little outrageous with the interpretation. We've talked about it. So, what we're leaning into is what is called propaganda. Now, propaganda is the propagation of ideas to an audience. What propaganda is, the definition that I want you to know, is the use of advertising techniques to sell ideas. The same way you sell soap, the same way you sell McDonald's, the same way you sell dish detergent, the same way you sell a sports car or a computer game, you can use to sell ideas. So, if you want to sell an idea, get a slogan, get a symbol, take some examples that are egregiously emotionally charged out of context and present them to the people. One of the most effective propagandists in human history was a guy named Joseph Goebbels. Joseph Goebbels was a German who ended up becoming Hitler and the National Socialist Party of Germany's chief propagandist. He ran the media in Germany under Nazi rule. And what he once said was that if you speak a lie loud enough, repeatedly, people will eventually start believing the lie. So lie boldly, lie consistently, lie repeatedly, until you yourself no longer know what the truth is really anymore. That's a horrible way to live. But historically, it's a great way to sell ideas if you're unscrupulous and if you're allowed to get away with it. Propaganda is more than simply tilting right or left like various media outlets today do. Propaganda is what you see during political campaigns, where you hear about your candidate who's noble and good and wise and strong and experienced, and the other candidate who's greedy and evil and sneaky, yes, precious. That's propaganda. Creating an icon, an image of virtue and rectitude, that's your guy, and of incompetence or evil, that's the other guy. And all parties do it to varying degrees. Propaganda is the way that totalitarian governments, like in communist China, North Korea, back in the Soviet Union and Russia, in Venezuela and Cuba, in those countries, all information is processed by the ruling party in order to convey the message that the leaders want the people to know and believe. Hitler's Germany did it, Mussolini's Italy did it. All authoritarian, strong-armed, and totalitarian regimes of the right and the left employ propaganda. American political parties do too. Now, there are varying kinds of propaganda. But propaganda is the use of advertising techniques to sell ideas. Oh yes, that affects public opinion. More next time.